Good evening, everybody. Thank you and welcome to our board meeting tonight. Adila, if you can please do a roll call for us.
Yes. Chow. Here. Tanya Budi.
Here.
Mendoza.
Here.
Halpern.
Here.
Cartha.
Here. So the first item on our agenda is a public hearing on the 2018-19 tentative budgets. At this time, we will open the floor for the public hearing on the 2018-19 District 65 and Park School budgets pursuant to Illinois School Code. Tentative budgets for Evanston-Skokie School District 65 and for the joint agreement for the operation of Park School were presented to the board on August 20th, 2018, and were on display for more than 30 days. A notice published in the local media announced that the board would hold this hearing. If there is anyone in the audience who wishes to address the board regarding the tentative budgets, they are asked to step to the podium at this time. Okay, then this will then complete the public hearing. Okay, so if we can go on to the approval of the meeting agenda, Rebecca?
I move that the Board of Education approve tonight's meeting agenda as presented.
Second. Chow.
Yes.
Tanya Budi.
Yes.
Mendoza.
Yes.
Halpern.
Yes.
Cartha.
Yes. Our next item is superintendent and board remarks and district recognitions. I just wanted to kick off just to really quickly point out that one of the items in our consent agenda is a gift acceptance. It is a donation of $5,000 coming from the PTA Equity Committee to Rice School. And I just wanted to highlight this one because it is near and dear to me as the culmination of a couple of years' work that PTAs have been doing in the district around equity goals around fundraising and to address some of the gaps that students might be experiencing. And of particular importance, we talked a lot about students at Rice and at Park Schools, which are our students in the district who don't have necessarily the benefit of, as in the case of Rice School, that does not have the benefit of a PTA. So one of the things that the Equity Committee, there's a lot of information that is out there, and I invite people to look into the PTA Council website that has more information about the PTA Equity Project. But this donation to Rice is coming through the board because Rice doesn't have a PTA. There are other donations that are going to be going to Park and to some other PTAs as part of the fundraising work that we've been doing since the spring. So I just wanted to highlight that and again thank the collaboration of PTAs. It's been a really creative and dynamic group of parent representatives who have come together to put forward this plan, and I'm excited to see it culminating in this first of what I hope can be many fund distributions in coming years. And then with that, Paul, if you want to.
I have a series of announcements and updates this evening, but I want to start by reflecting on the wonderful life of Lorraine Morton, who passed away recently and was really a trailblazer in so many ways. And I'm going to be joined in my comments by Meg Crewley, who's the president of DEC, our teachers union, and Jim LaRochelle, who worked with Mayor Morton, or Principal Morton actually is a better way of saying it, at Haven. And I know many of us in the community had a wonderful opportunity to celebrate her life and the contributions that she made this past Saturday. And I just wanted to read a statement that we've posted on our web that really highlights the contributions that she made here in District 65. So we celebrate the remarkable life of Lorraine Morton as a longtime teacher at Foster Elementary School and Nichols and Chute Middle Schools, as principal at Haven School, as Evanston's first African-American mayor. Her life and legacy is one carefully woven into our community history. As an educator early in the 50s, Mayor Morton took a path less traveled. She broke down racial barriers, she championed desegregation efforts, and she pioneered equity in our schools. As one of the few black educators on the North Shore, her firsts were among many, from serving as the first black educator to teach summer school, to breaking the color line at Nichols, to serving as the District 65 Language Arts Chair, to leading the Haven school community as principal. Her impact on children and families in District 65 and in Evanston was and continues to be unparalleled. As superintendent, I had the pleasure, as many people did, of meeting with Mayor Morton regularly. My 1-hour meetings easily stretched into a second hour and on an occasion into a third hour where we discussed her take on education in Evanston. I cherished her unwavering support, her constant push, and her commitment to this community, one deeply rooted in all things Evanston. She was honest when it came to facing challenges. She stuck to her beliefs, and she always remained deeply committed to a quality education for every child. Her life, her commitment to serving our community, and her love of District 65 and the children and families we serve will always be remembered. And as we learned on Saturday at the celebration of her life, she lived by the credo of that stated, "Only a life of service is a life worthwhile." For all of us who serve in Evanston in District 65, we honor and celebrate the life worthwhile of teacher Lorraine Morton, of Principal Lorraine Morton, and of Mayor Lorraine Morton. We will miss her dearly. I'm going to ask Meg to come join us, and then followed by Jim.
Thank you. My name is Meg Crewley, and I'm speaking on behalf of the teachers of the District 65 Educators Council. Tonight, we are here to honor an incredible woman who served our district and community for many years. Lorraine Morton was a pillar of the Evanston community, serving as a dedicated educator, political figure for the bulk of her career. To many of our teachers and staff, she was our teacher, our principal, and our role model. She actually was my principal at Haven, and actually when I became interested in teaching, she gave me encouraging words of advice. For many years, Mayor Morton gave the first day message to teachers. She was always uplifting, honored how hard teachers worked, told us we were amazing, and set a tone of inspiration for us to begin our year with our students and families. Mayor Morton was always accessible to the district educators. One memory shared from Audrey Soglin, current executive director of the Illinois Education Association and former District 65 teacher. She says, "My memory was when I was teaching 5th grade at Dewey, and my class was reading Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I asked Lorraine to be a guest speaker to talk about her childhood growing up in the South. She was the principal of Haven then and really busy, but she came over to Dewey and told her story. You could have heard a pin drop in that class. She was so dynamic and engaging that my class begged her to stay. It was really funny because she agreed to come to my class, but she refused to tell us how old she was. She made me promise I would never tell anyone that she could speak about that particular era, concerned about anyone knowing her age, and I never did until now." Mayor Morton touched the lives of so many students, educators, families, community members. She will be remembered and missed by the DEC community of educators. Tonight, we also have one retired teacher, Jim LaRochelle, who taught under Mayor Morton, who would like to share his experiences.
I am Jim LaRochelle. I worked in District 65 from 1970 until 2001. And as proud as I am having served that long, Lorraine worked in District 65 for 36 years as teacher, as has been mentioned, as administrator. And I had the pleasure of knowing her when she came to Haven as principal. She had been teaching at Chute. She was a team leader, grade level leader. She came to Haven at the urging of a then school board member by the name of Rachel Golden. And Lorraine came to Haven after some difficult year preceding. She still took the job, and she was a take charge lady from the get-go. She implemented a team teaching exercise as or organization as she had at Shute, where she was recruited to come from Nichols, where she had been the first African-American teacher, then recruited by Oscar Shute, who had been the superintendent back then. And Lorraine implemented that plan. She had 3 grade level leaders, all males, and she liked to refer to them as her boys. She took great pride in that. As I said, she was a take charge lady. She would, any instances where kids were misbehaving in some way, she would speak to them or to the group in the auditorium sometimes and read them the riot act. And afterwards, she would come out and wink her eye because she had done her thing. She put a little fear of God and a big fear of Principal Morton in the kids' eyes. And Meg's over there nodding, and she said, I remember Meg as a middle school student at Haven. But Lorraine was not only a colleague of mine for 12 years. I was honored to join the group of boys later on after she'd been there a few years. She decided I was worthy, I guess. I had been a guidance counselor at the beginning of my career at Haven, and then later, after about close to 21 years in that capacity, and the positions were eliminated, I returned to classroom teaching, taught social studies at Nichols, and was proud to find out that Lorraine had been there in a similar capacity long before I even came to District 65. She was an extraordinary, as Dr. Gorin said, woman, and I think tributes to her not only last Saturday's memorial service at the Millar Chapel on campus, the naming of the Civic Center, the Lorraine H. Morton Civic Center, H standing for Hairston, her family name. And I found out at the memorial service Saturday that down south, when people introduced themselves, they used all their names. So in fact, she was Constance Lorraine Hairston Morton. And I did not find out, and I don't think any of my colleagues from back at Haven knew that her first name was Constance. That came to light when a wonderful movie was made about her life. And if you have not yet seen it, I would like to put in a little plug. I know it's been shown at Northwestern when it was first put on, and then it's been at the public library, and I believe it was also shown at the Morton Civic Center. It is going to be available again at the Century Theaters complex downtown Evanston on October 21st, which is a Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m. And if you have ever met Lorraine or know anything about her and you have not had the good fortune to see this film, I encourage you to go. I do know that per the roundtable last week, that tickets are available, but only on Eventbrite. And as Dr. Gorin said, A Life Worthwhile is the name of the movie, and that was from her father, who said a life of public service is a life worthwhile. And Lorraine put that to practice from her beginning days out of Winston-Salem Teacher College, and then into her political career for 16 years as the mayor, the only person to serve that long. As I said, an extraordinary lady, and I was happy to have worked with her for her 12 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I continue with announcements, I don't know if anyone from the board wants to say a word, or?
I just want to jump back to SUNY's, the PTA Equity Project. Yep. For the thousands of people watching at home, they can still order food from Is
Yes.
it Old Neighborhood Grill tonight and from?
From one of
Oh,
13 restaurants.
Many,
yes.
many
Restaurants,
Evanston restaurants, and portions of those sales will be going to the PTA Equity Project all week long.
Yes, thank you. That is correct.
It's a big audience at home, yeah.
Let me underscore also, congratulations. I met with John Mitchell, who's the principal over at Rice, and he was touched. And this has never happened in his building. And so it was just a lovely moment of a caring community caring and showing their care. As I talk about equity, the equity work of the district continues. I think as people know, all of our licensed staff have been trained in Beyond Diversity. We accomplished that at the end of the summer, and very excited about that. We're doing additional Beyond Diversity sessions and seed cohorts as we speak. We just started our work on affinity groups that will be occurring as we move forward during the school year. And many of our staff are going to be attending the national summit of the Courageous Conversations, the Pacific Education Group, coming up in Philadelphia. And we're excited. What we've offered is to staff members who haven't gone to the seminar, to the summit, to be able to participate in that. Finally, to end my comments, tonight also I want to recognize a colleague who is spending his last Monday night with us. We hope he comes back again early and often. But I want to tip my hat and say thank you to Peter Goddard. And I do this both professionally and personally. Peter and I have known each other and been working with each other for 7 years, so prior to both of our arrival here at District 65. Peter has been a wonderful colleague, you're still here. Peter is a wonderful colleague, is a wonderful and challenging thought partner. He's had the amazing ability to take data and complex information and make it usable in this space called the Board of Education meetings, with our colleagues at the teacher and building level, with our principals, with the superintendent's cabinet. He took on great responsibilities on our equity agenda, and part of the celebration of having all of our licensed staff trained in Beyond Diversity was a coordination effort that he did with Ismael Nunez, who I also salute. And he's made major contributions to efforts to think about how we improve our organizational health. So I want to just formally and in all sorts of wonderful ways thank Peter for his service to the children and the families of Evanston and Skokie, and thank you for your work and your dedication for everything you've done. You've left a legacy, and we're going to twist your arm to come back and help us on a few projects as well. So thank you very much. Thank you. And that concludes my comments.
Any other board comments? I just want to really quickly echo everything that Paul said, and not only your ability to make data digestible and understandable for those of us who are not as versed in the world of statistics and whatnot, but I think the way you embraced our equity work and really infused equity in how you present it and how we could look at data is something that is lasting, and I think something that will be a legacy that you leave in this district. So I can't thank you enough for that, and yes, I agree. Please make sure that we find a way to continue working with you. I hope that is something we can do.
Thank you.
I'll echo. I heard your name, Peter, before I had the opportunity to meet you, from people singing your praises, and you certainly lived up to your reputation, and I absolutely appreciate, and I think can't say enough about the impact of your commitment and your ability and your bravery to infuse equity into our conversations about data. For so many people, they think that those two concepts are separate, that one is purely a qualitative experience, right? And one is a completely quantitative experience. So the ability to put both of those together is a true skill and one that our institution has been deeply impacted by, and I think lots of people have gratitude to you for. So thank you for that. And I'll also say, I didn't have the opportunity to know Mayor Morton well, but her legacy is an inspiration, and I wish I'd had the opportunity to to know her better and to have been impacted in the way that many of you all spoke about. But I was just talking to my daughter the other day about a legacy, and I was telling her that's what you leave behind. And I think that there's not much more that you can ask for than to leave a legacy. So thank you all for sharing.
I just have one statement. Thank you again, Paul. And I want to congratulate everybody in our school district that might be celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15th through October 15th. I think that we have very many contributions that are made through teachers and staff. And I wanted to take this time to publicly acknowledge and recognize and thank my Latina sister, Ismalis Nunez, for all of her work that she did. And when you talk about legacy, I think that she left an incredible legacy behind here in our school district, and I did want to publicly thank her for that. And I think her and Paul made a great team. And it was incredible. Before I sat behind here to just watch you on television, and people do watch. I was one of them, and I was always just so impressed by the change and how you really changed the discourse around equity in our district. So I've had the pleasure to tell you in person, but I want to thank you again publicly, both you and Ismailis, for your work. Thank you.
Okay. With that, we will move on to okay, so we'll move on to public comments. Members of the public are welcome and invited to address the board during open public meetings. The Board of Education will not permit the voicing of personal attacks against any district employee or board member. Please remember to, well, we don't have anybody signed up for public comment, so I will not worry about that part.
I think we have one person maybe didn't know.
Somebody signed up?
Oh, okay. So in that case, so please remember to state your name and that you have 3 minutes to address the board.
I apologize for not signing up.
That's okay.
Good evening. My name's Jack Darren. I'm a Nichols parent, and I also serve on Mayor Haggerty's Climate Action and Resiliency Plan Working Group, which has a draft plan out in the community. We had a forum that the mayor led on Saturday morning. Thank you, Board Member Mendoza, for coming to that and participating. And at that, we learned that the district has offered to join with the city in reaching these really bold goals about net neutrality on carbon and powered by 100% clean energy. And I just want to thank you for that. I think that really, your participation and the participation of the other major employers in town really help make those bold goals possible. And I would hope some really exciting benefits for the district in terms of reducing your energy costs and attracting investments in more sustainable technologies as we go forward. So look forward to working with you in the future towards that. The plan is on the city's website, and there's a public comment period that goes through the end of this week. So encourage everyone to check it out and tell us what you think. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Candace?
I move that the Board of Education accept the recommendations outlined in the attached group motion and approve the personnel appointments, leaves and separations, August 2018 board and committee minutes, destruction of July 2016 closed session audio recording, July 2018 list of bills, treasurer's report, and budget amendment, Washington school field trip, and the gift acceptance for Rice School.
Cho,
Yes.
Tanya Vudi,
Yes.
Mendoza,
Yes.
Halpern,
Yes.
Cartha.
Yes.
May I add one more set of announcements, and I'm going to echo what Rebecca just said, and it's pertinent because of what you just approved. I want to salute the work of Ismalis Nunez, who came to the district as a social worker, worked at Haven, doing fantastic work. She then was promoted and worked in our central office here as the coordinator of family and community engagement. And then she advanced to the coordinator of family and community engagement and equity, and did work that was legacy building. So when I described earlier the lifting of the Beyond Diversity training and the broad diversity training in this district, what Ismalis provided for the district paves the road for the future work that we have. And indeed, thank you, Rebecca, what Ismalis and Peter did in working together and working with Corey Wallace and the cabinet and the rest of our leadership team and our principals and staff has been monumental in the work that we've been doing. So we wish Ismalis well as she begins the next stage of her career working with the Pacific Education Group as a consultant in their equity work around the country. And when I say that Ismalis and Peter paved the way, by the approval that you just did of the consent agenda, we are just so happy to announce the appointment of Joaquin Stevenson as the Director of Equity and Family and Community Engagement. Joaquin comes to us from District 219. He's had a distinguished career already as a teacher and as a dean and as a curriculum director. He's a SEED facilitator, well-trained in that. He's a Beyond Diversity facilitator, well-trained in that. And he has an infectious professional and personality, bar none. And I think you might have your fan club with you today here as well. And there's a reason for it. So it's just a distinct pleasure to introduce to the board and to the community, the Evanston and Skokie community, Joaquin Stevenson as our new Director of Equity and Family and Community Engagement.
Hello, everyone. Bienvenidos a todos. I stand before you very humbled to stand here in 65. This is a dream come true for me as a brown, heterosexual, Mexican-American male, raised in Humble Park by a single mother, 3 boys, Manolo, Joaquin, and Diego. I can't be here without saying their names, and understanding what it means for me to be in the skin that I'm in and to lead equity, family, and community engagement. To start of the understanding of who I am, I have to start of how this journey began related to SEED and Beyond Diversity. Obviously, Mom raised 3 Chicano boys that understand who they are and how to show up as they are, and understand that people pronounce my name Joaquin, that I understand my name is Jack in English, pero soy Joaquin, y es todo. Part of my recruitment after teaching at CPS and a dean at CPS, recruited by a slew of individuals at D219, one of which, my first building meeting, seeing a white male principal speak specifically about race, to a point where I was worried about this guy. I couldn't believe it. But right then I knew that I was in the right place. He's here today. His name is Kane Osborne. He's now the superintendent at Lake Zurich. My first sit down with Paul Gorin, I had a very similar feeling. Once we went into our racial autobiographies, what it means for him to be a white Jewish male in this work together, and what it means for me. And in that piece, really to see there's windows and mirrors we saw in each other's story. And also understanding the gravity and the intentionality that the cabinet members took with interviewing. It was a very tedious process, it was very rigorous, and it made me understand of how much this team is dedicated to this work related to equity, family, and community engagement. Paul says there's an energy about me that's infectious. There's individuals that believe this guy, it can't be who he is. Well, you gotta meet my mama. And when you do, you understand that this is real. But only over time will you understand who I am and what I represent and what I'm gonna give my passion and soul to this community every single day. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome.
Welcome. We are very excited to have you joining our district and to be working with you. So thank you for being here and welcome to the district. We'll move on to our next agenda item, which is budget adoption. Anya, would you like to?
I move that the Board of Education adopt the final 2018-19 District 65 budgets, including aggregate expenses for operation of Park School as presented.
Second.
Do we have a presentation?
We do. We have a short.
We have a very short presentation, and we're not going to be going through assumptions, I promise, because that information is on our website. So for those of you interested in the details, please check our website. The budget book and budget at a glance is posted. So let me share. Let me share with everyone just the most important things about the final budget, and also discuss briefly changes from the tentative budget, what looks different. So this is still a balanced budget, 17th balanced budget, and our revenues total $139.7 million and reflect a 5% decrease from FY18 actuals and 3% decrease from the FY18 budget. Expenditures total $136.1 million and reflect an increase, 7% increase over actuals and 4% increase over FY18 budget. Operating surplus of 4.4% will be added to the referendum reserves and preserved to balance future deficit budgets. So what has changed? So on the revenues, on the revenue side, we had a almost $400,000 adjustment, primarily because of the CPPRT. Better information from the state resulted in a 10% increase. We also had a small adjustment to a $7,000 adjustment to other local revenues, and another positive adjustment to federal aid of $198,000 related to the prior year Medicaid funding. The state has been sitting on over $1.6 million of our Medicaid money, and even though it's federal revenue, it goes through the state, and unfortunately, because they struggle, they release every so often a little bit. And but we feel strong that our estimate for next year will be slightly higher because of that payment that came in July. On the expenditure side, a $324,000 increase, primarily because of the new, a couple classroom support positions and other minor salary adjustments to the existing positions. Consequently, there was an adjustment to benefits of approximately $40,000. Instructional supplies and materials increased by $100,000 because of the classroom furniture and software expenditures. And termination benefits, which is very hard to budget because it includes payouts for sick and vacation days for people who are leaving us annually, and it's an unknown, increased by $41,000 this year, and we did have several more employees retiring at the end of last year. And this slide just illustrates the new positions that were added to the budget. We had 15.5 FTEs that were added because of the enrollment changes, programmatic changes, as well as the district's priorities. And 6 positions because of the efficiencies, and actually 5 of those positions were budget neutral. This slide, which was also shown before, shows efficiencies implemented in FY16. 360,000 will result in savings to our taxpayers because of the lower renewal of insurance, medical insurance, and these savings will carry into future years. Updated financial projection slide, and really the message from this slide is the same as what we were saying in August. So basically, we will have balanced budget through FY '21, true balanced budget, using assumptions that we know today. And then starting in fiscal year '22, we will experience deficit budgets, which will be balanced with referendum reserves through FY '25. So yes, we are budget balanced through FY '25, but it's not true balanced budget situation. So I think it's important to point out that that this is what we're projecting right now, and again, this will be updated in February once we get the annual CPI factor, and will probably look slightly better because the CPI is trending up. It's around 3% currently, we will have a saving and spending phase, and that's what's illustrated in this side. And you can see the bottom row illustrates the size, the projections of our referendum reserves. So at the end of this year, we will be hitting 21.6 million, and it's better what we projected last year because of the phenomenal results in fiscal year '18. But again, because of these deficits, we will be spending it down to the point that FY '25, these reserves will not be sufficient to cover deficits in FY 2026. And this is the same information just in the bar graph form. And again, the green portion is the referendum reserves. And you can see that they are going down. And thus the overall fund balance will go down and will probably be under required 25% level in FY '25. A lot of uncertainties related to pension cost shift, which is included in projections, property tax freeze legislation, CPI factor, of course, is assumed. It will be known for FY '18 in January of 2019. Teacher's contract is ending. This is the final year, FY '19 is the final year of the contract, so a lot of uncertainties related to the staffing cost. And this slide illustrates our next steps. So after the budget is voted on and adopted, it will be filed at the end of October. We have 30 days to file with the Cook County Clerk and with the State Board of Education. And in the fall and winter, we will be bringing information to you, to the board, we'll be brainstorming, we'll be looking, identifying solutions, potential cost reductions, and efficiencies to balance future budget deficits. But we will be looking for long-term solutions, not just one-time cost savings that don't really balance anything. Again, I mentioned in February 2019, we will be updating our long-term financial projections, and during the spring and winter, we will be working also on the implementation on Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, which is basically presenting all financial information, expenditures in particular, by school location. So this year actually, we'll spend a lot of time talking about expenditures for certain locations. Right now, our budget is by program, is by fund, so there will be another layer and another presentation by location, which is now will be required by the state. And I believe will be included in the FY '19 school report card. And that's all we had.
Any questions or comments? Right, so then can we move on to adopting the budget? Vote?
Cho?
Yes.
Tanya Vudi?
Yes.
Mendoza?
Yes.
Hilpern?
Yes.
Cartha?
Yes. And with that, we'll move on to our discussion items, the first of which is our strategic plan Q4 end-of-year report.
I'll take the lead on this, and then my colleagues will chime in a minute. As you know, on an annual basis, we provide documentation of progress towards our strategic plan. We actually do this on a quarterly basis, and then we pull all the information together on an annual basis. And this shows us where we are and where we're going in terms of the work that we have underway in the system. You have in your packet the strategic plan year in review, and again, this annual report provides us with an overview of the work that we've completed under the umbrellas of high-quality teaching and learning, thriving workforce, a safe and supportive school climate, family and community engagement and equity, and financial sustainability. And what I'm going to do is turn to each of my colleagues for a couple of the highlights of the report that we're assuming you've read, so that we can just highlight those and then hear any of your questions or thoughts. I'll turn to Stacy for Stacy Beardsley on high-quality teaching and learning.
All right. I think a couple things to just emphasize, both in the year-end summary as well as the quarter four summary. So in District 65, we've entered our third year of a very intensive focus on K-3 literacy. This is the third year where we are intentionally connecting our district half-days and our instructional coaching with a focus on strengthening early literacy performance. K-1 is continuing to focus very specifically on reading workshop with intention around data-informed small groups, and our 2-3 folks have moved into a greater focus on language, and that is work with words, that's discourse, and it's vocabulary. So that work we're excited about, and is really, it's 3 years where we're building upon similar practices, and we've seen some very strong initial outcomes in our younger grades, and we're interested to see how that continues to build and connect with our work in 4-5 and middle school. Additionally, in the past year, with a strong emphasis in quarter four and quarter one this year, we really dug in with our instructional coaches and our department leads to develop and strengthen an understanding around culturally relevant practices. That work was engaged in through professional learning with our department leads and our coaches, and really culminated with a design of a 2-day institute for all educators that weren't participating in Beyond Diversity this August under the leadership of Jamila Pitts, and really some wonderful and strong contributions from a number of teachers in our district. I think Jamila had over 30 people that contributed to the design and the implementation of that professional learning. And so really a strong and powerful collective effort that is going to be continued this year in a voluntary PLC space, as well as through integrated design in our disciplinary learning. And that integration of the culturally relevant practices into our professional learning is going to be supported with our ongoing professional learning design for our coaches and our department chairs this year. Additionally, Curriculum and Instruction supported the launch of the Access to Innovate program, which is focused on putting iPads as learning tools in the hands of our 6th graders. We had a Access to Innovate camp over the summer that was attended by over 80 middle school educators, 2.5 days of professional learning that was also designed in collaboration with teachers, as well as contributions from Apple, as well as other external organizations. Really got very strong feedback on that, and our Access to Innovate coaches are actively working with our teachers right now. We also had summer professional learning projects where we had 4 different teams of teachers looking at existing units or practices and modifying them to support strong technology integration into these units, with a focus on our EEE framework, which is to use technology to strengthen engagement, to enhance learning or extend learning, and so really thinking about those aspects. We additionally have spent time and energy really taking a look at our practices within two-way immersion. A group of educators worked very hard on a dual language framework this summer, and that work is informing some of our work at Bessie Rhodes, as well as our other TWE classrooms in District 65. That work is also going to continue this year. As we came to the end of the summer, the educators as well as leadership agreed that an ongoing working group to further solidify that dual language framework would be the best and strongest approach into this work.
Next is our thriving workforce, and Beatrice Davis will talk about that.
Can you
microphone?
to the microphone?
I'm sorry, moved it back.
So with regards to the thriving workforce, in terms of the work that was done during the 17-18 school year, a couple things I'd like to highlight. work that we've done to try and listen to our employees regarding their work for District 65 and gathering information through survey data. This is something that's very important to us because currently the only way we could have a gauge on this is through the 5Es data, which is only allowed, only educators, only our teachers participate in that survey. And so by doing a district-wide employee survey, all staff, regardless of whether they're full-time, part-time, licensed or non-licensed, were able to participate. So last year was our second year in implementing that survey. We also had some focus groups that tried to get a little deeper into the data, and so now we've done, we feel like, a great deal of listening, and now it's time to move towards some action, and that's what we're going to work towards this year in terms of being able to influence at a district level, but also have some pockets area of concentration that we're going to focus on, specifically in this building in JH. And so that's an exciting thing that we're going to work on this year after gathering all the information last year. Another thing just in terms of recruitment that will help our recruitment efforts, in addition to trying to reach out to other organizations and job boards and historically Black colleges and universities, there's been some shift, or there will be some shift in the HR department. We did a review last year of positions and are we properly staffed to really help support the work of the strategic plan, and in doing that, we have 2 positions, HR partners who are going to work very strategically with our hiring managers and our principals specifically to get a jump on hiring needs, to really think about the staffing in each particular building, what they need, what they're looking for, and so that we can be very mindful and intentional in terms of trying to start the recruitment process earlier. There are a few challenges with regards to timing, just in terms of when we know positions are going to become available. There's some contractual languages that can sometimes be a challenge, but having these additional positions will be a great way to really make sure that we have the supports in place to help our principals. Our principals do run the run the process for hiring for their buildings, and so we want to make sure that we're giving them as much support and guidance early on in the process. And so that's something else we're looking forward to this school year, and hope to see some real progress in those areas.
Next, we turn to Joyce and safe and supportive school climate.
So this past year, we launched our classes, our SEAL classes, which was our social, emotional, and equity learning classes in kindergarten, 1st, and 4th grade. What we have done over the summer was to expand that work by having a group of staff develop some curriculum to really enhance the cell learning that goes on in the other classes in 2nd, 3rd, and 5th grade. So we're hoping that we have really a comprehensive program of cell learning for our kids in elementary school. In 6th grade last year, we started our Advisory 2.0. One of the components of that is some social emotional learning work that we developed using restorative practices that works and incorporates into that some equity work with our students. We also have combined into our Advisory 2.0 for this year a service learning project that each student in 6th grade will be required to take part of. Another piece that we worked on last year was we completed the training of all of our school climate teams in each of the schools. At this point in time, we're really looking through to develop each of those school climate teams more in terms of their work, and we've identified areas for each of those teams that we want to address with them through both their work in their teams as well as work with the principals themselves. Our restorative practices was also, we trained every elementary school last year. This year we are expanding that to our middle schools. And we provided some additional training to staff in social and emotional learning so that that could as well be incorporated into the curriculum.
We now move to Peter and Family and Community Engagement and Equity.
Thank you. A number of updates related to the work that Ismailis Nunez and myself completed last year. First, we spent a lot of time working on foundational learning related to having courageous conversations about race. As of the end of last school year, more than 500 staff members had completed our Beyond Diversity seminars. And as of the start of this school year, the number is closer to 900. We provided opportunities to deepen racial equity learning and racial literacy through Courageous Conversations National Summit, where we sent 44 staff members last year. We also facilitated 7 seed cohorts, serving more than 125 staff members and families. This current school year, we have 6 seed cohorts that are just getting underway now, serving nearly 200 people. And also this year, for the first time, we're offering Sprout, which is a follow-up around adaptive leadership for those who have completed SEED. And last year, we also had 4 different meetings of our racial affinity groups. Another innovation last year was to begin to look at the way that we partner with different organizations and ensure that a racial equity lens is embedded in our contracts and agreements with those organizations, requesting that they consider how they are thinking about equity as they serve our students and families. In regard to our community schools, thanks to some grant funds, we expanded community schools to Oakton, and at the end of last school year, we brought in a fabulous new staff member, Rosa Shriver, who is really rethinking our community schools model and figuring out how to improve the services we're providing through community schools at our 3 schools this year. We also, throughout the course of the year, supported affinity groups for parents, both the ABC group for African, Black, and Caribbean parents and the Bilingual Parent Advisory Committee. And our family liaison, Eleanor Giaga, did a lot of work in welcoming new families and offering classes to families on a variety of topics.
Thank you. And then last but not least, on financial sustainability, Raphael.
One of the critical things that the board made a commitment to the community about, which we're following up on, is transparency in the communication of how the referendum resources is being spent. And one of the steps that we took last year in doing that is, for the first time in the district history, we actually issued an annual financial report that really showcases and focuses on the expenditure of FY17. That information was mailed to every District 65 resident out of Evanston and Skokie, and lets the community know what we are doing with the referendum, what the revenue looks like, what the expenditure looks like, so they have a better feel for how the tax money is being used. That's one thing that we did this past year. Another thing is last year we developed a 5-year capital project that, in keeping with the referendum commitment made by the board about spending $1,025,000 a year of the referendum money on fixing up the buildings that we have. And part of that, we had 2 secure entrance projects. One was at King Arts, the other one is at Washington. And those actually will be completed by the end of this month. And there will be a ribbon cutting on the 4th of October that actually lets the community know what the expenditure was used for. Those are 2 of the projects. There were other projects that were completed, such as asbestos abatement, bus cutout at Willard, that made sure that kids are safer and we focus on their health so that when they go back and forth from school, they're in a better place and safer. One other thing that I want to point out is that as we develop this year's budget, we started using more priority-based budget. And before that, what we also try to do is change the language of how we do budgeting. In the past, when we talked to the board, we were looking at using the referendum savings from now to be able to balance the budget in the future. But the way we're thinking about things right now is trying to make sure as we develop budgets, that revenue actually matches expenditure. So for as long as possible, trying to make sure that we don't even touch that referendum money. So we start earlier in trying to look for ways where we live with less and we do more. And that's a different way of defining our priorities in budgeting. And we will dig deeper into that as we develop the FY20 budget, which will start in the wintertime.
And so with that, this is a quick snapshot of what we reported, again, on a quarterly basis, and then this is the annual report. We'll get into the conversation on the scorecard in a minute, but we'll pause now to hear questions or thoughts. And again, we remain committed to staying focused on the strategic goals of the district and reporting back on a quarterly basis where we are, where we're going, the bumps that we're having along the way, and the successes that we're having along the way.
Any questions or comments?
I have a couple of questions. Joyce, I was curious if, when you talked about the equity learning that was embedded in the SEAL classes in Advisory 2.0, if you could give an example of the content of those lessons or that work might be with children?
So we used Corey Wallace to give us some ideas. We did used some of the lessons from Teaching Tolerance. She did some work with kind of taking a look at the lessons that we had, and then she tuned them more to having an equity bent. I can't give you an example off the top of my head, but that was our concept.
And have we gotten any feedback from children or parents in response to the content?
Well, Stacy did some focus groups on Advisory 2.0 and SEAL.
Yes. So in Advisory 2.0, we did student focus groups and did teacher survey. For the course in Advisory 2.0, we have FUSE, executive functioning, social emotional learning, and then there's a world cultures strand as well. The student focus group information was really quite strong. The kids communicated that they found that the course was valuable. We had students specifically say that they drew on the social emotional learning in order to figure out how to better regulate their own emotions and how to build stronger relationships within the district. With the executive functioning, they made direct connections to the learning in their Advisory 2.0 class, to their own ability to organize themselves as they've arrived in middle school. They reported using a number of the strategies. They did, and they also supported the idea, the rotations that we're doing. They're in a section for 10 days. They said to us that they wish the rotations were a little bit longer. One thing that they do miss to some degree was a degree of study hall. And so they kind of said, we don't want it all the time, but if we had it one day in every rotation or 2 days in every rotation, that works. They also really liked the kind of student-led choice aspect of FUSE, which is a STEM-based learning set of modules that's designed by Northwestern where students have a good degree of choice. So the feedback as a whole was positive. The educators said they felt like the orientation needed to be strengthened, so we did that work this summer. We also revised the executive functioning and the CEL modules as well. So it's going to be interesting. We'll conduct the focus groups again later this year. But the initial signs were that we're moving towards a design that we're meeting kind of an interesting set of needs, and students were communicating that they were finding ways to apply that learning.
Thank you.
Anything else on this?
Just thank you.
No, yeah, thank you. So then we can move on to the 2018 strategic plan scorecard discussion.
So let me start, and then Peter will do some slides, and then I'll finish up before we have your questions and concerns. So the scorecard provides our annual look at how we're progressing on student outcomes as it relates to the strategic plan. And again, this is the snapshot of progress over the past year. We'll be reporting in more detail on the Achievement and Accountability Report in January when we come. I think there are at least two important messages from the data that we present. One is for the year that we just had, and then the other one is over time, the trends that are evident. In terms of the year that we just had, 2017 and 18, there's important progress to highlight. There's progress in 17-18 over 16 and 17 with regard to making expected gains. Reading went up 1.2% and math went up 6%, again between 16-17 and 17-18. There's progress in 17-18 and compared to the previous year on decreasing the percentage of children who are at or below the 25th percentile. Reading, we had a decrease of minus 1.4%. Math, we had a decrease of 2.4%. And again, that's just in comparison to the previous year. And there's some progress in the subgroups making progress in 17-18 over 16-17. The reading, we had 2 of 5 subgroups. These were Black students and students who have IEPs, as compared into 16 where we had 1 of 5. And in math, again, looking at the subgroups as identified, our Hispanic students, students with IEP, and students who are on free and reduced lunch showed progress in 17-18. So 3 of 5 groups rather than 2 of 5. So the progress is really important to note, and especially as we move forward aggressively on our equity work, we move forward aggressively on setting goals around student performance in our school work plans, and as we continue our work on culturally relevant practices. The other signal, though, that we have to pay attention to, and which is really the next part of the report that Peter will give, is that we still have much more work to do, and we have to work even more urgently as our trends over time on this work indicate that we must accelerate progress to meet our 5-year goals as we've set with the strategic plan. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Peter to talk about the trend analysis.
Thanks, Paul. I think what's important to maybe start out with is just what is the strategic plan scorecard and why would we look at it? And how is it different from the Achievement and Accountability Report that the district produces and that you'll look at in January? The Achievement and Accountability Report is one that long predates my work in the district and that looks at the academic outcomes for District 65 in quite a bit of detail. The purpose of the strategic plan scorecard, however, is to provide a snapshot on an annual basis about how the district is doing compared to the goals that it set when the strategic plan was adopted. So tonight we'll be looking at a very little amount of data that is meant to just gauge whether the outcomes that were envisioned when the strategic plan was adopted are being achieved. And later in the year, when we have the opportunity to look at the Achievement and Accountability Report, we can disaggregate that data and look at it in a lot of other ways. So before I get into the couple of data points that are important from the strategic plan scorecard, I just wanted to take a minute to remind us all of a few things about our lens for interpreting data for equity. First, it's important to note that data in education has historically been used to perpetuate inequality and to justify outcomes that are not acceptable in a system committed to equity. And we recognize that this reality is present even as a district as we seek to use this data to inform equitable decision-making. A second point that I think is important to note up front is that when these aggregate data that we look at show that members of a particular student demographic group score below benchmarks, these outcomes reflect opportunity gaps faced by marginalized groups due to institutional racism in the education system. These results should not be used to draw conclusions about the efforts or abilities of these students or of their families. A fourth point that I think is worth noting is that when aggregate data show that groups in District 65 are outperforming state or national averages, or that score gaps in our district are similar to those at state and national levels, these results do not mean that the district can have any less urgency in its efforts to promote racial equity in terms of our academic outcomes. And finally, just a couple of notes about the measures of academic progress, or MAP, which represent the data behind what we're going to look at tonight. A couple things are important here. First of all, MAP measures reading and MAP measures math. And that's not the full extent of what students know and are able to do. And so it's important to recognize that our students have a lot of talents that they bring to the classroom that aren't going to be measured by this assessment. The other thing to keep in mind is that we should take a balanced approach when we look at assessments. Assessments have historically been biased. And even though the assessment that we're using has been statistically tested against having bias, it doesn't mean that whiteness, which pervades so much of our society, is absent from this assessment. And so while this assessment is important, and while this assessment tells us a lot, it's important to take it with a grain of salt and to keep in mind that there are some biases that could be present in the assessment as well. So with that preamble, let me just go into the couple of key data points that we want to look at tonight. First, we're going to look at college readiness benchmarks. So these are somewhere usually in the 60th to low 70th percentile on the MAP assessment, and they are a cut point that we track where when students are above that cut point, they're more likely to score higher on the ACT when they get to high school, at a level where they're more likely to pass their freshman year classes when they enter college. When the district adopted the strategic plan, we set goals for increasing the percent of students who met benchmarks in reading and in math. On this chart, SY15 was the benchmark year, and you can see that we were looking for a target of 68 in reading and a target of 62.6 in math, and that was based on improving on historical trends that existed at the time that the strategic plan was adopted. Where we are today is having trended away from the target in reading and also having trended away from the target in math. And in both subjects compared to last year, we also see a decrease. The second metric that we're tracking to measure the progress of our strategic plan is related to students who are in the bottom quartile. And this is a metric in both subjects where we've seen some years where we've gone up and some years where we've gone down compared to our baseline. In this most recent year in both subjects, we have some good news, which is that the percent of students who are scoring at or below the 25th percentile in both reading and math has decreased. But that percentage is still higher than where we began at the time of strategic plan adoption. So trending the way we would like to see it compared to last year, but still a larger percentage at or above the 25th percentile compared to where we were when the strategic plan was adopted. Next, we look at the percent of students making expected gains, or as some of us internally have referred to it, making expected gains plus, based on the definition of the metric that was adopted when the strategic plan was approved. In order for a student to be considered making expected gains, according to the metric that we report for the strategic plan, they not only need to make the national average gains compared to other similar students in terms of their grade level and their initial score, but they also have to make more gains than the error on both the pre-test and the post-test. So this is a much more rigorous metric than most districts track. And so when, as a district, you're at about the 50% of students making expected gains, you're actually doing a lot better than the national average. When we adopted this metric, we were looking for improvement in both reading and math. We set a target of 44.9% in reading and a target of 56.9% in math. So keeping in mind that 50% would be well above the national average, 56.9 is a very aggressive goal. And what we see is for both subjects an increase compared to last year, and for math, a pretty substantial increase of close on 5% from the time of strategic plan adoption, with 54.6% of students currently making expected gains or expected gains plus in math. So a real highlight here is what's happening in our math classrooms. And later tonight, we'll look at some results from the 5 Essentials survey. And you can see that when it comes to instruction, math instruction is one of the real high points about what's happening in District 65 there. So in among these data, I think the expected gains in math is a real high point for us, both in terms of moving right on toward the 2020 target, and that movement being supported by the 5 Essentials data where our students are reporting being challenged in their math classes. Our fourth goal is our racial equity goal. And when the strategic plan was adopted, the metric that was used to measure whether we were moving on racial equity was whether students were achieving college readiness benchmarks. So the slide that you've got in front of you is for reading, and it shows the percentage of students by student demographic group who met college readiness benchmarks in reading. And so you can see that this most recent year, we have a 1 percentage point increase for Black students. But really, the trend for Black students has been up and down each year since the strategic plan was adopted. For Latinx students, the students are, as a whole, 4 percentage points lower on this metric than at the time of strategic plan adoption, and that's been sort of a slow downward trend. And for white students, we've had some up and down trends mirroring the Black students. One thing that's important to note here is that we have several other student racial ethnic demographic groups who are also important to us in District 65, but because these groups make up a smaller percentage of our population, they're not reported on this graph. The other two groups that we've represented here are students with an individualized education plan, or IEP, and students who qualify for a free or reduced lunch. And these groups were highlighted here because they also make up more than 10% of our student population. And so trend-wise, what you can see for students who qualify for an individualized education plan, or IEP, is that we've seen some up and down trends, with the most recent year being up. And for students with a free or reduced price lunch, you can see that we had sort of a downward trend in the first year of strategic plan implementation, and then it's been flat since then. I think the other thing that we can't pass by this graph without observing, although those of us who look at our data a lot are very familiar with, is that obviously in our district we have a huge disparity in outcomes between our white students and our students of color. Similarly, we have a graph here that shows the same student demographic groups and their performance in math. And you can see that for our Black students, we've had a slow, steady downward trend since the time of strategic plan adoption, with a decrease of about 1 point compared to last year. For our Hispanic students, we see a very slight but steady upward trend over that same time period, and kind of an up and down pattern for our white students over the same period. For students who have an individualized education plan, we had a drop during the first year of strategic plan implementation and then a slow, steady increase since then. And the same pattern for students who qualify for a free or reduced price lunch. So I will leave that there, and then Paul may have some comments about the implications.
Yeah, and I think the comments that and the data that Peter provides show the trends over time, and shows the issues that we must face as a district, and it's a clarion call for urgency and how we address the trends over time. We do see those signals of some improvement from in 17-18 over 16-17, but the trends over time signal to us the importance of continuing the work with the urgency. What are parts of the work? We are implementing culturally relevant practices and really engaging our children and our staff on how to really reach kids in their learning processes. We're diving deeper into our multi-tiered instructional processes, and this is a data-driven process using a tool that drives instruction and identifies where kids are struggling so that teachers can actually appropriately do the type of teaching that's necessary. We're using our Courageous Conversations and our equity learning to really interrogate our practices. What are we doing? How can we change them? And then to disrupt our practices. And I think the equity training that we've had over time and especially over the summer when we lifted it across our teacher force, is really important. In our school work plans, these are focused on the achievement of students, but really focused on Black and Latinx students. And as you know, we have a specific focus on Black student success, and Dr. Green, LaTarsha Green, is helping us with that. And then finally, we are continuing, as you heard earlier, our school climate and restorative practices focused deeply on relationships and on the important relationships that are necessary to improve the learning process. With that, we leave it open for questions and comments and concerns.
Questions? Joey?
I guess it's not so much a question as much as a comment. Right, significant system-wide change takes 4 to 7 years. And this is 4 years worth of data, and if you do what you've done, you're going to get what you got. So you're right, there's definitely areas here where I think we'd like to see the opportunity gaps close. One recommendation, because the opportunity presents itself with Dr. Green sitting here at the table, but also with Dr. Stevenson, who just joined the team. 2 people joining the leadership group who were not a part of the ideation of these goals, who can, without being outside consultants, provide a consultancy or auditing lens to see if the people that have been sitting at the table are setting goals that are both attainable and realistic. And you know, it's a great dynamic opportunity that you have as a leadership group to get together and say, were we on the right path with some new eyes at the table, and let some new people come in and poke holes at it. And so I mean, I certainly recommend looking at that, because the data shows if they're not even flat, right? It's if we look at it year to year, it's not so drastic of a difference, 1% here, but over 4 years, it's the wrong direction. So,
LaTarsha, do you want to say a moment about the consultancies that you're leading with Andalip in the schools, and how that line that I just used, which is interrogating and trying to disrupt practices, what we're about?
Absolutely. Part of the work that I'm providing some support with Dr. Kelgadi on is really looking at problem of practice identification for school leaders, really trying to get a gauge on instruction, but the systems that support and or provide a hindrance to good quality instruction in the classrooms, as well as helping build capacity around data-driven leadership to inform teachers' practice. So in previous environments, I felt like that has been a huge asset in terms of helping to kind of turn things on its ear, as to be a little more informed about who our students are as learners and what challenges they might particularly have. And so I think, coupled with some of the equity learning that we as the adult learners are engaged in, helping us to understand a little bit more about the lived experiences of students is one of the large focuses or foci of the problems, what they're presented. So it's called a POP consultancy. It's a problem of practice consultancy. And each school will have the opportunity to really dig and dive into some diagnostic problem identification. That work within itself helps to solve some short-term issues, but over the long term is really helping to just tune the lens of leaders to really get a root cause analysis, and then help turn that learning to their school improvement teams, et cetera. So it's kind of a ripple effect that we're forecasting, so to speak, and it's part of a larger master plan, so to speak. But that's one of the strategies that we're implementing.
thank you. And this is the type of example for me, when I look at the economic cost of SEED and Beyond Diversity training, that I'm completely comfortable with. But it can't just be about exposing 900 educators to a 2-day training. What's the expected outcome when I look at a staff survey that says that almost a third of staff maybe don't feel like the workplace is welcoming because of their identity. That includes race, that includes religion, LGBTQ aspects. You know, what if that's all related, right? The person that makes me feel uncomfortable in the workplace might also have 25 kids of their own, and their relationship there is not peer-based. So a future scorecard, I would love to see, what does this group think are the expected outcomes that maybe aren't statistical, maybe they're behavioral, right? Maybe they're organizational expectations. Again, I don't know what the answer is, but if we're not hoping to see statistical changes, and I think we are, if the changes that are precursor to the statistical changes are organizational behavior, what are they, so we can know what they are? I think it's really important to name them, because then you can set the expectations for all the adults that work in the organization.
Yeah.
Right? If we're not talking about it here, then I would assume that we're not talking about it anywhere. So, thank you for describing some of that.
I think that leads to some of the, comments that I was going to make, but I have a question too. So when we're looking at year-to-year progress, we're looking at the comparison of one aggregate group, right, to the next aggregate group that comes into that grade level. We're not comparing the longitudinal progress of cohorts.
Correct. So for each year, you're looking at a group of students from 3rd through 8th grade. And each year, we have a different set of 3rd graders and a group of 8th graders who's moved out.
So I think then that begs the question of if an aggregate group of students was not achieving expected outcomes in the previous year, then are we looking for the growth metric for them in the next year? Are we comparing them to the previous cohort that came before them? And what does that data tell us? I think the other comment that I was going to make is long-term, we've been talking at a board level about looking for a measurement of social and emotional learning. And what I'm hearing in your comment, Joey, is a little bit of like, so what are the, and I also heard it in your presentation, Peter, what are the other skill sets and talents that folks bring to the table that are not measured? But also, what are we looking for in children's development in our institution beyond acquiring subject matter knowledge? And I think that that's an important metric that we're missing. I'm glad to hear us talk about it as a priority, as something that's being embedded into our schools, just the thought of what does culture and climate look like, and how are we providing students with a space to develop skills, and to also demonstrate their skills, their social and emotional gifts and strengths. But I think that we need to be talking about it at the board level too, and thinking about it when we're having a conversation about the health of our district. I would agree that it's disappointing to see the trend, but I think I always feel conflicted when we have conversations about standardized test outcomes because of the reality of the history of standardized assessment tools. And so we're both in one breath acknowledging the racial bias of the tools, in another breath validating them by using them to measure ourselves. So it's a conflicting conversation. I mean, in general, I want to see those, I mean, that's the measurement that we're using. And if that's the measurement that we're using, then we should see growth. And it's heartbreaking to not see it. And I know that for those of us, the closer you get to the direct service of this work, the more frustrating it becomes. So I don't want to dismiss or that experience, but I would love to hear more about if you all have any particular conjectures as to why you think we're seeing some of those downward trends. And I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the places where we did not see downward trends, where we did see progress. We have some things to celebrate as well. So I would like to hear more from you all about the things that we feel like we're doing well that produce some of those positive outcomes on the scorecard, and some of the things where we may need to course correct that may be contributing towards some of those downward trends.
So you mentioned a little earlier, and I'll take, I think your question is fairly big and broad right now, and I can respond to a couple pieces, but to get down into the granular would be probably, I'm going to not do justice to a number of places. In regards to cohort data, we do use cohort data in order to assess the impact of our programs and our program evaluation. And so we take a look at cohort data by grade level and by school. And so within our literacy work, we take a look not only at the outcomes similar to that we report here, but then we also look at cohorts, and we use that cohort data to assess impact of our program and also determine where it is that we may establish stronger partnerships with principals or teachers or grade levels, and use that information to inform coaching and professional learning design. And so we do look at several different cuts of the data to really try to inform our work, and in that we're clearly also looking at full grade level and by race and the similar categories that we're using here to ensure that we're really trying to be as informed about the decision making and the work that we're doing. So that's number one. Number two, I think when we take a look at the kind of the data reported tonight, the fact that we saw a rebound in making and expected gains is an important step. One of the things that we talk about quite frequently within the curriculum and instruction department is that in order for us to make progress on what is a far too large achievement and opportunity gap in this district, we need to sustain steady increases in making and expected gains for students of color and STIC and language learners over a sustained period of time. And a lot of the research talks about the fact that you really have to have 3 consecutive years of strong growth in order to address the kind of significantly improve that achievement and opportunity gap. And so, we are not happy with where we are in the least, but what we see is that there was positive movement in making expected gains, and we need to, our process has been evaluating that work. We see strong progress in math. We know that curriculum has now been in place in the district for several years, including our Spanish version. And we're really trying to continue to deepen our differentiation work there, as well as study a bit of our, I would say, our achievement patterns as kids get later in K-5. We see a really high number of kids making college readiness benchmarks, but we also see increases in kids in the bottom quartile, which means that we invest more deeply in our tiered intervention work to try to ensure that we're intervening earlier to avoid some of those gaps and opportunities. Similarly with literacy, we really have tried to focus very heavily on K-3 over the last couple of years. That is a difficult strategy when you look at these numbers, because these numbers talk about learning in 3-8. And so we are continuing to use this data and to inform the work we're doing in the younger grades, and we continue to use our one-to-one literacy assessment data to try to inform changes and shifts in practice. And we are working hard to align moving into the pre-K, but pre-K to 8, to better understand the experience that learners need. Bottom quartile, the students in the bottom quartile is really at the heart of our, one of the things we did with curriculum instruction team is we framed the fact that curriculum instruction is responsible for all tiers of instruction, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And Donna Cross, as the director of MTSS, is a really important member of our team, and she has worked hard to, one, improve the problem-solving practices in our schools, and two, over the last year, took a good look at the tool that we were providing to educators to write intervention plans. And in collaboration with educators, we've selected a new tool that we really feel is a much stronger tool for teachers, not only in thinking about ways to write stronger intervention plans, but it's also a better entry point for educators, and it's less time intensive and more intuitive for users. So we're hoping that by supporting process and improved curricular interventions that we're going to see continued progress in the bottom quartile. We saw a small decrease in those numbers this year, but again, we need to continue to push down those numbers because we know the implications of being in the bottom quartile as they move through our system and they enter ETHS. And your last comment about this test, I fully agree. As long as this is the measure that is measuring our progress and our impact, the fact is it creates, it limits options for our students going forward. We need to make sure that our work impacts and accelerates and shows up in these metrics.
I think another answer with what Stacy just said so eloquently is that as we looked at some of these data, we asked ourselves the tougher question of to what extent is the work that we're doing aligned? And so the work that we're doing on literacy as it relates to the school climate work, as it relates to the equity learning work that we're doing, this has to mesh together. And so that it's not just patchwork in search of a quilt, it's actually working hard to build an environment in the school building where we're actually addressing curriculum instruction and teaching and learning and better outcomes. So we spent time this summer talking about how all of this work should be under the umbrella of culturally relevant practices, and that when we're doing restorative practices, as Joyce was talking about, or when we're focusing on literacy, as Stacy's talking about, or when we're really going deep on both Black student achievement and student achievement writ large, as LaTarsha's talking, and we're really doing deep dives into what our data say, that this has to be aligned work, not separate work. And I think that's the direction that we're really going, and it gets translated out into our school work plans that set very specific goals for improvement, very specific goals for improvement of Black and Latinx students. And that drive then is a drive that we have with our principal colleagues to really look to progress for children who are not succeeding at the levels that we think they should be succeeding.
Yeah, it was referenced within the memo, but in the work we did really digging into culturally responsive pedagogy last year, the group really dove into and explored a lot of different individuals that have written in research and practice in this space. And as a district, we landed with Zaretta Hammond's culturally responsive, essentially framework and her practice areas. And we think that her practice areas really create a really strong opportunity for synthesizing important work that's been happening within this district. And so it pulls in the importance of climate when we talk about safety for kids and talk about the opportunity to build stronger learning relationships among peers and adults. It pulls in the ideas of restorative justice. It pulls in the ideas of really strong cognitive and information processing work within our classrooms. And fourth practice area there is equity and equity awareness. And so what we felt like this brought to us was a place to really say, these are the things that have mattered the most in our work, and it creates a synthesized place for us to move that work forward. And so we hope that that kind of connection has power in our work and the work of our educators.
And one more thing, Anya, that you brought up, which is the measurement around social emotional learning. Joyce, do you want to say just a word about the small pilot that we're doing at the early grades with Clark McCown's work?
We're actually having a training tomorrow with our staff that are trained to do SEAL. So our pilot is going to be, kindergarten, first and fourth grade level. where we're going to do some pre and post, well, actually, I think we have 3 times during the year that we'll be collecting data for the kindergarten, first and fourth grade on some social emotional learning aspects that Clark McCune from
Rush University.
Rush is going to be doing the training with us. So we're excited about that. Donna Cross and I connected with him during the summer. We set up a lot of different details in terms of how to get the technology and what we need to do to support getting students to be able to respond to questions. So we'll see how this goes, and we'll provide some information on it as we go forward.
So this is assessment, this is an assessment of social
For so.
learning?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So I appreciate, Peter, you saying in the beginning this is a snapshot because, and we will be getting into more depths in the accountability report later, because it begs a lot more questions than it answers. You know, having been here 5 years ago when we started to develop the strategic plan, I certainly would rather be hearing different information, right? We would all rather be hearing different information, and yet there is some positive things happening. I think the right question that I feel like I should be asking is, based on this snapshot, and you've already talked about it, Dr. Gorin and others, what we should ask is, does this mean we should be stopping, or doing the same? You know, what is it, how does it align with the work that's being done? And that's the question, I think, to put back to everyone as we move forward. What does it say about the work that's being done? I also do feel like unpacking, and this probably may come later, unfortunately you won't be here to deliver it, but as we look at the investment in early literacy that's been done, are we seeing any patterns there among third graders or fourth graders that would be different than the aggregate? So, you know, kind of looking at some of the disaggregated data where we've been making strong, consistent investment, and are we seeing more of an uptick there or not, and how can that point us to, should we be, again, maintaining, double down, change, et cetera? So that's something that a question it raises for me that maybe we can spend more time as in January. And the same thing, lifting up, to Dr. Green's point, lifting up some specific grades or schools or places where we're seeing a lot of light shining. I recall when Oakton was talking about some of the work in early literacy that was being done there last year, or it was probably late last year, and we were hearing the examples of the advancements kids were making. I feel like we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our communities to lift up some of those shining lights as we juxtaposition it against the data that we are not satisfied with and not happy with, but understanding maybe where there is some traction and things that we're going to be replicating and spreading it. So I would look hopefully to those conversations, as well as, you know, knowing that we are seeing some gains in growth, and that's the gateway. Yet we have to sustain that. I thank you, Stacy, for pointing that out, because I think that is the linchpin of this. If we can't have successive, consistent, higher than much average growth, especially for our marginalized students and marginalized populations, we're not going to break any of the cusp on the college readiness benchmarks, and that's what's so disheartening. So, thank you.
And if I may, this goes back to Joey's question about sort of fresh eyes coming in. What Dr. Green's doing, what Tarsha's doing, is by doing the deep dives in a couple schools, while we celebrate the progress that we saw last year at Oakton, we'll get some sense of where things are happening that are really worth celebrating, that we can actually spread. And other times we will probably find where things aren't worth celebrating, and then we have to actually do some intervention at that point. So it's our opportunity to do that deep dive in our schools while we are aligning our practices.
Yeah, I think, you know, looking at this, it's pretty sombering, and I think I'm I'm encouraged by thinking that this is not what we measure our kids up to, or that I hope that this is not a measure of who our kids are. And I think we've had a lot of conversation, not only at this table, but in this community about where our values stand and what we select as the measure. And of course, this was, selected 5 years ago, and this is what we're dealing with. But I think as we continue to have these conversations, I would hope that the measure of our kids is more than their reading and their math scores, and how do we capture personal growth, and how do we, I just, sitting here, I think about the conversations that are had at dinner tables where this is the priority, when they're talking about our schools, when they're talking about their peers, and I can't imagine that they're very uplifting conversations. So I just, as I sit here, I hope that we can remember that we set these standards and we set these goals that we want to meet for our kids. So as we diffuse this information, I think moving forward, we have to think of better ways to measure growth and better ways to encourage our educators. And I think about the word college readiness, we're preparing our kids for an educational system that's changing, for innovation that's changing. We have institutions that no longer require ACT scores. And so how are we getting our kids their portfolio ready when, our colleges aren't going to ask for ACT and ACT scores? How do we value the whole person? And I know right now it sounds very esoteric, but I really hope that as a district we can place a value on our kids for more than just these 2 scores, and that the conversations that are being had around this information as a community, that we can really work together to change that dialogue in a positive direction. And how do we fill those gaps, and how do we encourage successful stories at schools that are taking place? So I think for me, I just think it's worth mentioning that on our end, we have to determine for years ahead what that measure is going to be. And if Sergio was here, I'm pretty sure he would have gone through the list of alternative measures and all of that. But that's my contribution to the conversation.
And I think it's a yes and. So I really appreciate the perspective on personal growth and the perspective on taking a different lens to growth to really honor the assets the kids bring with them from day one when they walk into our kindergarten classrooms through grade 8. The yes and, though, is that we also want to set children and young adults up for success so that they're on the pathway to success when they land at the high school, and whatever they end up doing as they go beyond the high school. So it's a combination of both, and I want to make sure that we stay the course and accelerate the learning that has to occur for kids to be successful in their different grade levels as they head to high school, and then as they head to college, to work, to other opportunities. So it's a combination of both that's really important.
I will say ditto, I think, to everything that my colleagues here said. I think the only thing that I would add to the conversation is, as we're looking at, investments in the K through 3 literacy framework and analyzing those, that we really need to continue with the work that we started last year around the Early Childhood Task Force and looking even earlier into the early childhood experiences that our students are bringing with them. Dr. Gorin and I just finished up the fellowship at the Erickson Institute, something that Candace participated in last year. And, really, this is going to, before the kids even come to us in the district, we need to be looking at those experiences and working with our community partners to make sure that kids in our community have that there are the assets in our community that are necessary for appropriate brain development and all of that so that hopefully when the kids are coming to us, we can just see smaller gaps in the first place. So I think we really need to include in all of what we've talked about, in terms of lifting up the positive work that's happening in individual schools and individual classrooms. We really need to work with our community partners and look into what's happening prenatally, but certainly when, kids are born. How are we supporting families? How are we supporting access to childcare and health care and all of the things that children need to be healthy and then successful once they do come to school?
Well, and as we learned, and I assume Candace did as well, from the president of the Erickson Institute, those first 1,100 days of life are so essential. And so then what can we as a community, we have to take our own responsibility as a major community player, but what can other community agencies and support services do to address those first 1,100 days? And indeed, Cradle to Career is at least stating that we're working towards kindergarten readiness. So what does that really mean? And how do we express that in urgent ways as well?
Right. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for that presentation. We will move on to our next discussion item, the 5 Essentials Board update.
And let me also kick this one off and then head over to Peter for some deeper analyses. The 5 E's are opportunities for us to get some sense of where we're at and where we're going as it relates to the component parts that actually make up our strategic plan as well. The five essentials, which were developed by the University of Chicago, are really the driving force behind everything that we're doing strategically around effective leaders, collaborative teachers, involved families, supportive environment, and ambitious instruction. These data that we present to you also show some trends that are going downward. There's a couple places where we can highlight some growth on academic press and ambitious instruction, especially, and places where the district is at state averages around effective leaders, collaborative teachers, and supportive environments. But we know that the best way to make improvements is to know where your strengths are and where your opportunities may need to be addressed, and I think that's what the report of the 5 E's provides to us today. So with that, I'll turn to Peter for his quick analysis of the survey results.
Thank you, Paul. So I think many of you are familiar with the 5 Essentials, but I'll just take a few minutes at the beginning to sort of situate what the 5 Essentials are, who participates in the 5 Essentials, and how is the data that we're going to be looking at generated. The 5 Essentials is a survey that was developed at the University of Chicago based on work in Chicago public schools over a period of about 20 years. And then in 2012-13, the tool was brought statewide by the State Board of Education. And so school districts all over the state implement the 5 Essentials at least every other year. Since that 2012-13 baseline, District 65 has implemented the survey on an annual basis. And for all of our schools during all of those years, we've had a sufficient participation rate to have a trend line for all of our schools. The respondents to the survey are students in grades 6 through 8 and teachers in all of our schools and centers, including Rice, JEH, and Park School. Beatrice mentioned earlier tonight that as a district, we do other surveys. There is a component of the 5 Essentials that's a parent survey that doesn't roll up into the 5 Essentials results. She referenced the staff survey, which is available in your packet, which looks at the feedback of not just teachers and licensed educators, but also other people who work in the district. We've done other work over time to assess the perspective on the organization from various people, whether that be surveys or focus groups. But the 5 Essentials is stronger than most of those things because it has such a strong research base. And that's why it's the foundation for our strategic plan. What the research shows is that schools that are strong in 3 or more of the 5 essentials are 10 times more likely than other schools to show improvement in student outcomes. So when we trend in the right direction and we move toward a stronger foundation in our essentials, we are more likely to see improved outcomes for students. And as I mentioned, as a result of this, we made the 5 essentials the basis for our strategic plan. So in terms of making sense of the results, just a few things about the data that we're going to look at. You'll see a lot of numbers that are on a scale from 1 to 100. Those are called survey measures or essentials. Essentially, survey measures are made up of sets of questions, usually somewhere between 3 and 10. And statistically, the answers to those questions are aggregated into an overall measure of a concept. So, for example, a measure on the survey is trust between teachers. And the survey asks 5 or 6 questions about the trust between teachers in different ways, some of which are harder to agree with, some of which are easier to agree with. And the teacher's responses to those questions aggregate up into a measure about teacher-teacher trust that's scored on a scale from 1 to 100. 50, which is right in the middle of that scale, was set to the statewide average in 2013 when the survey was administered statewide for the first time. And schools are bucketed into 5 different groups, as we'll see, based on the result. So scores from 1 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and so on, based on standard deviation in the statewide population. Overall essentials, so there's a score on each one of those 5, are based on the results on all of the questions that are part of that measure. So for example, we have an effective leader's essential, and that's made up of the questions that are part of each of the 4 or 5 component measures about effective leaders. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that the questions were answered by teachers and students in grade 6 through 8, and this was done in late fall and early winter of last school year. So what you are seeing is how people were experiencing District 65 in December and January of last year. I also noted there's an optional parent survey. We do administer that on an annual basis, and it's used by school teams. But we don't look at it a lot at a district-wide level. First of all, because there's a fairly low response rate, usually somewhere between 20 and 30%. Second, because that response rate is typically not very representative of our full population of families. And third, because this survey doesn't have the same research base rolling up into these important essentials and these important measures as the teacher and the student surveys do. Last thing before I dive into the results, last year 2 of our schools, Willard and Oakton, piloted a student survey for 4th and 5th graders. It uses exactly the same questions as the 6 to 8 survey, but those results are not included here, and part of why it's a pilot is that to some extent the vocabulary in the 6 to 8 survey is not always accessible to students who are in 4th and 5th grade. So when we look at results that are based on student responses, we're primarily looking at, well, we're exclusively looking at middle schools and the 6th through 8th graders in our magnet schools. In terms of response rates, last year 17 of 17 schools provided enough data to receive a report. You need to get 50% on both the student and the teacher survey. Our response rates on the student survey by school ranged from 85 to 91%. Definitely enough to make some generalizations about the results and consistent with our historical response rates. Teacher response rates were above 80% in all schools but 1, which had a response rate of 63%. So again, sufficient response to be able to generalize from the information and consistent with our high historical response rates. So let's dive into the data. First, I want to look at just the overall results on each of these 5 essentials. As I mentioned, this is scored on 1 through 100, and so what you can see is that in the most recent year, District 65 scored in the average implementation category, so around the state average from the norm year of 2013, in 4 of the 5 essentials, with more implementation, the next highest category being for ambitious instruction. So above state average in the next category above average for ambitious instruction, and at the state average for all 4 of the other categories. It's a pretty good place to be. There's room for improvement, but with only some improvement, we could easily get into district-wide a category where our schools would be set up for success in improving student outcomes. The flip side to that story that's worth paying attention to is that we kind of want to track the trend over time, especially now that we have 6 years of consistent data. And so what you can see based on that is a trend from one year to the next I wouldn't worry too much about, and a movement of 2 or 3 points I wouldn't worry too much about. And historically in these memos, we've basically said unless you move from one category to another, again, we're not sure how significant that movement is. But when we have 6 years of data and a trend is bigger than a few points, you can begin to make some conclusions even when we're not moving between one category or another. So you can see that there are some of these, like ambitious instruction, where we're above the state average, we're in more implementation. We're at 63 this year, we were at 66 when we started. We've kind of been up and down, but the district is in a pretty good place and pretty consistently in a good place over time. There are other essentials like supportive environment, where we start at 55 and we're now down around 47, where you could begin to ask some questions about whether that movement is more significant. And I think the important thing to do is then to dive down to the measure level and to the school level to see where is this happening, what's been going on in that school, what story can we tell that would match the data and help us confirm or not confirm that this is something to pay attention to. So in this presentation, we'll go into the data in terms of the different measures. We won't go into the school level data, although it is reported each October by the state of Illinois on the school report cards. So looking at our effective leaders, where we are today is 43. It's a very small decrease from the previous year of 45 and a very small decrease from the baseline year of 2013. So I'd basically say on effective leaders, we're pretty much flat over this 6-year period. And you can see that there's some distribution, but not a lot, in differences between how our district as a whole is scoring across these measures. We're in the average implementation category in 3 of the 4 measures, and in the less implementation category in 1 of the measures, which is instructional leadership. I think that's important to note about teacher influence and instructional leadership is that these measures were added in 2015. And so we don't have historical data from 2013 and 2014 to compare. But on this chart, I would say instructional leadership maybe stands out as the one measure to take a little bit more of a look at, given that the district between last year and this year moved into the less implementation category. In terms of collaborative teachers, you can see that we are in the less implementation category. And over the 6 years that we have administered the survey, even though we've really only, with the exception of 2015, bounced back and forth over a 5-point range or so, we are currently in the less implementation category when we have had some years, in the collective, I'm looking at collective responsibility. We've bounced up and down over the last 6 years within the same category of average implementation. And some of our sub-measures that make up collaborative teachers have bounced in and out of some of these categories. In the most recent year, we're in the less implementation category in 3 out of the 5 measures that make up collaborative teachers, with our lowest score of 35 being in collective responsibility, and our highest score almost in the more implementation category being quality professional development. In terms of involved families, this is an area that has historically been a bright spot for District 65. In 4 out of the 6 years, family involvement has been categorized in the more implementation category. In this most recent year, it's in the average implementation category with a score of 58, which is just 2 points below the cut point for the more implementation category. Very strong in teacher-parent trust, and just slightly less strong in terms of parent involvement in school and parent influence on decision-making. Something that's really important to note here is even though this essential is tied to research in terms of being a predictor of school improvement, it is reported on from the lens of the teacher. So this is not parents telling us how much they trust teachers or parents telling us how involved they feel in school or how much influence they feel they have on decision-making. This is teachers' perspectives on their trust with parents, on whether parents are involved in the school and whether there is parent influence on decision-making. So a valid and reliable measure, but just important to note, as you look at these categories, this is from a teacher's point of view. In terms of supportive environment, you can see that consistently over time, this has been in the average implementation category. We're currently at 47, which is down about 5 points from the previous year, and a little bit more than that from the baseline year of 2013 with 55. We have some bright spots here in terms of peer support for academic work with a score of 58, which is almost in the more implementation category. And then other areas that are lower, safety for the first time this last year was scored at 38, meaning less implementation. And with that in the less implementation category, it's important to note that this is just from the perspective of middle school students. And the types of questions that they're asked about safety are pretty direct in terms of, I feel safe in the bathroom. I feel safe in the hallway. I feel safe in the classroom. And that's what's aggregated together to make up this safety score. And then in terms of ambitious instruction, you can see this has been consistently an area of more implementation over the 6 years of the survey, currently with a score of 63. And some real highlights here would be our math instruction, which has been consistently above 90 for the last 4 years, so one of the higher scores that you would find in the statewide survey. Again, this is based on middle schoolers' experiences. English instruction with a lower score, but still within the state average implementation category. And then quality of student discussion and academic press, which is basically a measure of the extent to which students feel challenged and have rigor from their teachers, both being in the more implementation categories. So let me leave it there, and glad to answer any questions you might have.
Questions?
I have a question that actually was related to our previous discussion, but also relates to this last side in terms of ambitious instruction. I feel like there's some clarification that it could be useful for our community at large. When we talk about an emphasis on equity and culturally relevant pedagogy, then we also see the assessment of the ambitiousness of our instruction. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between those things, and the myth that somehow any emphasis on equity or culturally relevant pedagogy implies some kind of lower standard. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about how our standard of rigor is applied to building in access for folks who have historically been marginalized, as well as building culturally relevant educational environments.
Of course. So I think one of the elements that the district really found important in Zaretta Hammond's work was that essentially she puts the idea of rigor right in at the center of her definition for culturally responsive pedagogy. And in her definition, she said, if it is not about learning, then it is not culturally responsive pedagogy. She said it must be about learning. And some of the work that we did in the 2 days in August called out the difference between multicultural education, social justice education, and culturally responsive pedagogy. And at the heart of that is the fact that this needs to be rigorous, highly engaging, cognitive work, because it is about learning that ultimately we close the achievement and the opportunity gap for students. I do think, when we look at the numbers there around ELA instruction, when we took a look at MAP scores for literacy in middle school at the end of the year last year, we've made some very good, significant shifts in the type of literature that students are navigating, but it is that work that we went back to the kind of drawing board on to say, are we upholding the standards of rigor that need to be at the heart of activities. And so, we're returning to the standards, we're measuring to, are we keeping the depth and the challenge of the experiences in that learning? And I think, so that's important, and I think that's a very important piece of the work that I think Hammond will help us keep our eyes on and keep us anchored in.
Thank you.
Candace?
Two things I wanted to highlight. One relates to safety and is a question as well as a concern. Obviously, the drop in the safety measure. As I was looking online at the data, at some school by schools, there are also some other supplemental measures, they call them supplemental measures, that speak to safety too. One is teacher safety and the other is school safety. So I'm wondering how those other two, if they're reflected in the overall safety measure, if they're totally separate, and just, I think the other categories under this safety category, the other questions are also around safety to and from school, outside of the school versus school safety itself. So could you just speak to those differences in environment and those types of measures?
Yeah. So in the survey, there are a whole bunch of questions, but not all of which roll up to a measure that contributes to one of these measures that roll up to one of the essentials. These are just the questions that are part of a measure that's part of the research that shows that schools that are strong on these essentials are most likely to improve. So there are other things on the survey that are helpful to know and are helpful for school teams who are looking to think about how to improve their school, but those measures aren't part of what is predictive of future success. And so those supplemental measures that you would have seen are ones that provide information but wouldn't roll up into the safety measure that you're seeing here.
So then to this, just if you can play out what our teams are doing with this data, especially, let's say particularly around this one, safety. Safety is obviously a concern for all of us, for our students in our schools. So how are we unpacking and using these results to inform changes that we may be making in our schools or at the school level?
Yeah, so a big part of this is the school work plan and the school climate team processes. And so a big part of how we act on these data is to put the data in the hands of the right teams and to make sure those teams have the tools and the training to know what to do with data. So what we do each year is to provide a packet of reports to principals as they plan their school work plan process. The principals have their SIT teams meet several times over the summer and do a data review in order to identify where do we need to look further to identify root causes, and then based on those root causes, what strategies do we want to implement in the upcoming year to try to improve what's going on in the school. And so that's a process that would have gone on this summer, and this is some of the data that the principals in those teams would have had their hands on. And they wouldn't be looking at that in a vacuum because they've also had a time to do data review and root cause analysis in the context of their school climate teams. So when you read many of the work plans, which are now in draft form as people are getting ready to implement them this school year, a lot of them refer to strategies that were already identified and refined through the school climate team process. And we're looking at this data just reconfirmed. This is an area we need to pay attention to. So maybe this strategy from the school climate team needs to take more importance than some other strategies that we can consider. So there's a whole series of data analysis and then a series of root cause analysis as to why do we think the data shows us what the data is showing us, and then a strategy selection process in terms of the many good things that we could do this year and the limited resources we have to do them, what's the most important.
Okay. And then the second point was around what, as you were already mentioning, the academic press, and I remember us pulling out, and is that correct? Was academic press pulled out as one of the measures on the indicators?
Yes.
Progress indicators? So, in the spirit of looking for positives, I mean, I would like, 5 years ago, as we were developing the strategic plan again and thinking about rigor and how would you reflect, a leading indicator of students really feeling like they are having individual attention and being challenged at whatever level they are being challenged. And so I think we should celebrate that that's an area that we have focused on, and it has improved by 10 points, whatever that means in a relative fashion. And it's something that has gone hand in hand, with a lot of other focus and work, and we've been able to accelerate that. So I'd say hats off to our teachers and our administrators and all the work that's being done to make sure students feel like they are being challenged and continually challenged.
Mm-hmm. When the University of Chicago did this original work, as Peter said earlier, those schools that are outstanding on at least three of the measures are actually going to do 10 times better than other schools, and academic press is always part of that.
I think the only thing that I want to add to, the idea that, obviously, and I appreciate the explanation of, at a site level, how this data is being reviewed and used. I think also to think about it at a district level, how are we reviewing it and using this, and especially in conjunction with, as part of our information packet is the employee survey that Beatrice had referenced. And it shows, if we look at the effective leaders and collaborative teachers and, some of the dips that we're seeing on the 5 essentials, tracks with some of the dips that we're seeing from the employee survey. And I don't know, you would reference, Beatrice, focus groups in your, when we're discussing the strategic plan. And I don't know if that's reflected in the employee survey that we...
So the information gathered from the focus groups is not specifically referenced in that memo, but it is information that we're taking into consideration as we're moving forward. It's similar.
Okay. So it tracks similarly. And I'm just curious too, with the focus groups, like how were they selected?
So we worked with Hanover Research to come in and do the focus groups, and they made a random selection. They reached out to employees who requested either to participate or not, and then from that they took a random sampling, and it was teachers, administrators, non-licensed staff, and I think were there 9, I can't remember, 8 or 9 different focus groups where they collected information.
Okay. So I think, to think through how, going back to the work that Anya and I and you and Andalib and we're doing with DEC leadership, this is something that we'll obviously need to look into as well and kind of think from a district level, how are we going to get this information and then use some of the collaborative framework that we've been building over the last year plus to address climate in our schools and in our district. And hopefully, bring back some of the...
I think that's spot on, and I had the opportunity with Beatrice the other day to meet with the DEC executive team. This is the District Educators Council, our teachers union, and they seem very open to engaging on some of the data that we have here and really trying to collaboratively address workplace conditions so that we can improve workplace conditions. So that's a positive sign as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anything else?
Related to that, this is something that I've discussed a couple of different times. I can't remember if we've discussed it here at a board meeting, but in seeing some of the responses to the 5Es and also just having heard some anecdotal feedback from educators, given our emphasis on social and emotional learning for children, I think it's really important that we also create a positive social and emotional environment for adults. And I remain curious in how we are doing that. And are there spaces where adults are being encouraged to engage in social and emotional learning or conversations. Do we use any of our expertise that we've been developing around restorative practices for adult to adult relationships or adult to student relationships? Are adults in our institution being valued as social and emotional beings? Are they being given space to reflect and continue their own exploration and development? And I feel like if that answer is no or minimal, then we have to question how well we can expect that implementation to go with children. So I would love to hear more about if that is happening in any spaces and if there are any plans to make that time and space available for adults.
So part of the relationship study inventory that we do when we're starting with the school climate teams, there's a section that's student to student, a section that's staff to student, and there's a section that's staff to parent as well as staff to staff. So that's an important piece, is to look at relationships and where there may be concerns or thoughts or things that need to be addressed within a building, and buildings then make a goal to address that as well. In our restorative practices work, though, that's something that we are encouraging, is that we do circles within faculty meetings or in settings, team meetings, et cetera, where people all get an opportunity to talk and to share and to address their concerns. But it's something that we've discussed incorporating more and more in our work, is to use a circle format to really hear from people.
I also think through our Beyond Diversity training that we are using in more magnitude the compass. And so I know at the senior level we're using it to check in before our meetings. I know some of the principals are actually using that device to get a sense of where people are as they're moving into the problem solving they're doing, the teaching they're doing, the engagement that they're having. And I think that ultimately will have an impact as well.
I think a couple other things to highlight here. One is in our SEED experiences, about 200 staff have been through that so far, and we've got another 100 plus who are going through this year. There are opportunities to learn a number of social emotional skills. So empathy is a huge social emotional skill that's increased through participation in SEED. We also offer people to begin to develop the skill of listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And so I think a number of SEED participants have highlighted the emotional intelligence growth that they have made and they've seen others make through that process. And so it's one of those things where it's great to see increase in racial literacy and the ability to have courageous conversations about race and human connection and emotional intelligence grow beside one another. And then I think the other thing to highlight is work that's happening at the school level. So I mentioned earlier that a number of schools look at the 5 essentials as part of their school improvement process, aligned with the school climate work that Joyce was just talking about. And a number of them over time have made goals to increase things like teacher-teacher trust, teacher collaboration, and then gone about enacting a number of different strategies in order to improve that. And that can be everything from trying to change the culture of what it's like to visit another teacher's classroom. Right? Does it feel like a gotcha, or does it feel like, hey, we're in this together and maybe we can learn together, and maybe it'd be nice to have somebody else that I can trust who can, talk to me about what's happening in our school. Other schools have done things like incorporate mindfulness into staff meetings as a way to kind of just lower the pressure and increase the enjoyment of being together in an educational space. So there are a lot of really interesting and innovative things that are bubbling up from the building level in this regard as well.
We've also found that with intentionality, the 5 E's go up. So in one of our schools, there was some issues on teacher-teacher trust the principal and the SIT team actually focused on how to make some improvements, and they made tremendous improvements the next year. And then just as a sidebar, the mindfulness, I was at Oakton last week, and there was a mindful moment that was permeating throughout the school for the young people there and their elders to take some moments to reflect and to breathe and to start the day with a sense of self. And it was a really powerful moment because you could feel it across the school as people were taking deep breaths to start the day.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the report, for the discussion. I think it was really informative, and we will continue to learn and grow from what we have learned. That ends our discussion items. We have updates and upcoming work. Does anybody have any committee reports to share? I think we have policy coming up next month, another finance committee meeting in November, and some other committee meetings coming up soon here.
We have a head start.
Oh, okay.
Come on up,
Please.
Katrina.
Enjoy.
Good evening. Today, I am here to share the monitoring review results. But before I do that, we had the federal monitors here in March, and the staff actually shared, the parents shared comments that I would like to give to you while I bear witness every day to all the wonderful work that our paraprofessionals, our teachers, our special ed team, the custodians, our monitoring team does. I think it's important to acknowledge the hard work and dedication from the parents' perspective. So some of the things that they said was, staff made me feel welcomed like family. I feel like they really care. They asked how my child was doing, then they asked me how I was doing, and that made me feel good. They even remembered my older children's sports schedule. I chose the center because it looked clean and well kept, and that's the first thing I look for when I'm choosing a place for my children. The program has been life-changing for me. It helped me get involved in the leadership and community activities. Now I know what I want to be when I grow up. Staff helped me save my life, literally. If it wasn't for the staff, I may still be in a bad relationship. I was afraid about my child riding the bus for the first time, but staff talked me through the process, and that made me feel better. I still cried, but my child was happy. She told her dad, "You have to come see me ride the bus." I have had several children participate in the program, in the 0 to 3 program and the 3 to 5 program. Staff helped me get my GED a few years ago, and now I'm enrolling in college. My oldest daughter is in college too, and she probably would not be there without this program. 2 of my children have a disability, and I was afraid to enroll them in school because I wasn't sure if they would be teased, but when I went to the center, the staff made me feel comfortable and helped me understand the whole process. My children participate in the same activities as the other children, and that makes me feel good. They helped me apply for disability. It's a long, hard process, and I don't know if I would have made it without their support. I like the bond my child has with the teacher. Sometimes she listens to the teacher more than me. Another parent chimed in and said she noticed the kids bond with a lot of the staff, office staff, and even the custodian give kids high fives, pounds, and know them by name. When I was signing my child up for the program, I thought it was just going to be babysitting. At that time, I was just happy she had some place to go while I was at work. Then staff showed me that it's so much more than just babysitting. It really is teaching. Even though my child is only 2, she is learning because the teachers are teaching her well. I have seen a lot of progress since she has enrolled in the program. A grandmother spoke about how the system is so different since she was raising her children, and how staff helped her navigate since her children were in school. A mother stated that she was very excited about the father engagement activities because it gave her husband and child some one-on-one time together, but more importantly, it gave her some alone time. While many shared what they liked or loved about the program, there was one parent who insisted on sharing what she disliked about the program. When her child turned 2 years and 6 months, she received a notification from the center informing her that it was time for her child to transition out of early Head Start into Head Start or another preschool. She said, "The only thing that I don't like is that my child has to leave. The teachers and staff are so wonderful here. I wish she could stay forever." So I just wanted you to know and hear from the parents' perspective what an impact all of our staff, early childhood staff, are having on our children and families. For an update in terms of monitoring, the last monitoring visit for the Preschool for All program was in 2016-17, and we are on track to receive our next monitoring visit in 19-20, which is next school year. During the 2016-17 monitoring visit, Preschool for All earned a Gold Star rating through the Accelerate Illinois program, which is the highest rating that you can earn, and it recognizes programs that meet or go beyond the highest quality goals. In 2017-18, which was just this past March when the parents made those comments, Head Start received their federal monitoring visit. We could have another one as early as this school year. We will be notified if we will have it between October and December. This monitoring visit was comprised of 2 components, which was Focus Area 2 and a class observation. The Focus Area 2 focused on our systems and services. So they looked at things such as our program management, so our day-to-day operations, program governance, our relationship with our policy council, which is our parent board and the governing board, financial management, and something they call ERSI, which is eligibility, recruitment, selection, enrollment, and attendance, which impacts our funding. And then they looked at services, so health program services, early education and child development, and also our family engagement. And the report indicated that based on the information gathered, our Head Start program, District 65's Head Start program, and Early Head Start was found to have met the requirements of all applicable Head Start program performance standards, laws, regulations, and policy requirements. So as it relates to class is a teacher-child interaction tool that is used to do observations. It looks at 3 domains. One of the domains is emotional support. The other is classroom organization and instructional support. So we scored in the high range for both emotional support and classroom organization. And then we scored in the middle range for instructional support. The classroom portion of the review, there is a little bit of controversy as it relates to the Head Start world, but it's used to determine if, when our 5-year contract is up, if we will have to reapply competitively or if we'll do a renewal grant. So all of the agencies that were monitored during the 17-18 school year between September of 2017 and October of 2018, they're considered a cohort. So they will, on September 30th, they will finish their last reviews, compile that information, and by the fall, by the spring, they will let us know what the scores were for everyone in the cohort, and from there it will be determined. If we are in the bottom 10%, when it's time to reapply for the grant after the 1920 school year, we will have to either do a competitive grant if we're in the bottom 10%. If we're not in the bottom 10%, then we just renew the grant. If you are in the bottom 10%, it doesn't mean that your school necessarily did poorly, because say there were 3 agencies in your cohort, someone could have gotten an A+, someone could have gotten an A, and we get an A-. Because we're in that, happen to be in that bottom 10%, everybody did good, it just happens that you were in that bottom 10%. Again, I mentioned that it's a little controversial in the Head Start world. People don't think that's the way it should be. There's been a lot of rallying around it, but it's written into law, so it's what we have right now. So that's where we are in the process, so we'll learn more about that at the end of this school year or beginning of next school year.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that report. I don't know why we always make you wait till the very end. We'll try to move that around next time. But thank you so much. It's always good to hear about what's going on downstairs, and so really appreciate
Parent quotes were
it.
fantastic and should have been an hour ago.
What's that?
The parent quotes should have been an hour ago.
Absolutely. No, especially that, leading with that. I thought that was really great to hear. So we'll work on that for next time, but thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, if there is no further business, I adjourn this meeting at 9:40 p.m. Thank you.